You know, sometimes, I don't know how Pastor Randy does this, but I've always asked God what he wants me to say. What passage should I preach on before I start? And so a couple of weeks ago actually, I was asking God, what should I say? What should I preach on? And I'm looking at my Bible and I'm flipping pages and I'm looking and I'm trying to hear what he's got to say to me and like, what should I preach on? And I don't know, it felt like I didn't have anything. But I stopped at this page in chapter 13 of Matthew, and I was reading these parables. Jesus is talking, and he's preaching, teaching in parables, and it just, somehow, 3 verses stood out. 3 verses with 2 parables in them. And that's in verse 44, it starts there. But before I get to that, before I read those, before I read about the treasure and the pearl, is it Mark has it up there? Okay. Before I read that, I think it's important that we understand what's going on. You know, Pastor Randy always talks about the context, how he likes to be able to get the big picture of what's happening here. And so I need to look at the whole of chapter 13, really, because there's a lot of stuff in here that ties in to the passage that I'm going to read in a minute. You know, Jesus, it starts out really kind of strange. Jesus is by the Sea of Galilee. He's in a house. It says that in verse 1 of chapter 13. He's in a house, and he comes out of the house and sits by the lake. He comes to the lake. And there's a large crowd of people there. So he got into a boat. I mean, you've heard that story before, right? He comes out of the house. I didn't realize this, but he comes out of the house and gets in a boat. And he's speaking to the people. And there's a large crowd, and he tells them this parable about the farmer planting seeds, the parable of the sower. And you know the different types of soil. And so Jesus is teaching to this crowd of people. And I'm not going to go through that whole parable because it's a bit long. And, you know, the disciples come to him later on in verse 10 of chapter 13, and they ask him, why do you speak in parables? And it's kind of interesting, his answer. His answer really, he quotes from the Old Testament. He quotes from Psalm 78, actually, and part of Isaiah. He says, though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. So there's something going on here that Jesus understands that the crowd, probably most of them aren't going to get it. That's been helpful to me in my ministry of preaching, because sometimes I feel like everybody's got to get this, right? But you have to realize that not everybody does, but it's still okay. It doesn't seem to bother Jesus, so why should it bother me, right? But he says this because it's been prophesied that there will be people who will not get it, who will not understand, who will not hear. And for that reason, I think he comes along and he says, let those who have ears, let them hear. So that idea, that little verse there, let them hear, is something I think we need to think about. As I talk about these parables, I want you to think about that. Hearing is really important. Jesus wants us all to hear, okay? We don't want to be like those people he's talking about who never hear, never understand. He says, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. He wants to heal us, that's for sure. Okay, but then he says to his disciples, but blessed are your eyes, because they see, and your ears, because they hear. So right away we kind of get this idea that there is a difference between the crowd and Jesus' disciples. We are his disciples, aren't we? Yeah. Blessed are you, because you hear, you see. Okay. So Jesus goes on. Before I get to my passage that I want to get to, I'll just introducing you a little bit to what's happening here. Jesus tells another parable, the parable of the weeds. Now, you remember that parable? Farmer goes out, plants his wheat, And the devil comes along at night and plants weeds with the wheat. What do? Anna's a gardener. She knows about weeds.
Call the gardener.
Call the gardener. If you pull out the weeds, it'll rip up the roots of the wheat. You don't want that to happen. So you leave the wheat there, and when it comes time to harvest, you get the weeds out, and you pick the wheat basically at the same time, and then you burn the weeds, right? That's a part of the gospel story, because that really tells us that there's going to be a time when there will be judgment. We mustn't forget that. That's in the gospel. That's not something that we could just ignore. It's there. And Jesus brings that up. He talks about that. But this parable is a little bit different. What happens with this one is that Jesus explains the parable. It's really something that he wants his disciples to really get it. He wants them to really understand. So he's teaching them. And he takes them aside. He doesn't really give these explanations to the whole crowd. He's talking to his 12 disciples there. Then he gets to another point, another part of these parables that he brings. He's got several parables in this chapter. There's the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Or the kingdom of heaven is like the yeast. We need to know what the kingdom of heaven is like. And he's teaching the people this. He explains the parables of the weeds to his disciples. He talks about those things. And he really gives the impression that we need to know these things. This is not something that we should just ignore. The kingdom of heaven is something we need to know about. We need to know what it's like. So then we get to the parable of the treasure and pearl. Let's read together in verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Now, I don't want to just stop there. I want to keep going a little bit further because it sort of ties together. He talks about the parable of the net. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now he asks a very important question. Have you understood all these things? Yes, they replied. He said to them, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. When Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? They asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and in his own home. He did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Okay, I included that part in there, but because I feel that the message that I need to give today isn't just about the parable of the treasure, although that's an important part. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in the field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Keep that in mind. That's the basic thing that we need to know about the kingdom. It's like a treasure, okay? But when I read this passage, one verse stood out really, really big. Like, okay, there's a treasure, but that's not the main thing for me. Or is it? God wants me to understand about the kingdom, but there's something else he wants me to understand too. I looked at verse 52, just after Jesus asked the question to his disciples, have you understood this? Have you understood all these things? They say yes. Now, if you're like me, you know that the disciples often seem to show us that they don't get it. Right? Sometimes it looks like, what, they didn't get that? Of course they should get that. They didn't get it. There's a lot of stuff that you could say that when you're following along with the story of Jesus and their lives, their 3 years together, it seems like they don't always get it. Well, we might say they don't get it, all of it, but they got some stuff, right? They did get some things. And we know that later on, after Pentecost especially, they did get it, right? So that's important. But he says to them in verse 52, therefore, because you got it, right? Because you said you understood, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Now this version here is a little bit different than some, but the main idea here is that every teacher of the law should have stuff to bring out. Now this verse, I read in my commentary, this verse is a very difficult verse, they say. Many people interpret this in different ways, and if you think about it, what did Jesus really mean when he said every teacher of the law? Who was he talking about? You think of the Pharisees, first of all, because we hear of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and all those things. But you can't look at that verse without really realizing what's going on before it. Because he asked the question of his disciples, and they said, yes, we understand. And then he says, therefore, because you understand, every teacher of the law must be talking to them about being a teacher of the law, it seems. It looks like that. So, if you look at it this way, that the teachers of the law are actually the disciples. If he's been teaching them about the kingdom of heaven, he's been teaching them through these parables, they've grasped some of that. Then they need to be able to share that like the owner of the house who brings out of his storeroom treasures. Now, it's kind of interesting to me that the treasures, they don't really say what that is. And it could be a lot of different things. So that's why this parable of the treasure sort of speaks to me at the same time. I need to know what it is about that parable that's good for me. Well, before I get into that part, I got to explain a little bit more about this verse 52. Verse 52 says, therefore, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. It's important that we understand the comparison. He says the teacher of the law is like the owner of a house. And in the Gospels, the owner of the house often has stuff to share. He often has either a place for you to stay, or he's got food for you, or there's something good that he has to share with you. But I really need to know what's going on in this verse, because I believe there's a lot of stuff in this verse that's important for us all. Every teacher of the law, if you look at the commentaries on that, it could be every disciple of the kingdom. Everyone who has grasped these teachings, everyone should have this ability to share what they've got, these treasures that they've got. And I really want to understand what that means to me, because sometimes I don't really think of myself as a teacher of the law. Even though I've been teaching Sunday school for a long time, I know that the students often teach me more than I teach them. I really need that discussion going on so that I learn. It's not so much that I have something to tell them, as much as they can share with me and we can all grow together. So every teacher of the law could be a disciple. The Greek word for the teacher of the law, that phrase, is grammateus, which is actually a scribe. So every scribe should be able to share what treasures they have in them. Now, I really want to look at what another part of that verse says. It says in this version, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom. Some versions, I think this is the new NIV version, but the old NIV says something, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple, or does that verse say it differently? Something about the kingdom of God. Everyone who has learned about or knows about the kingdom of God. But it's not really that we need to know about it. We don't need to become a disciple about the kingdom of God. We need to become a disciple of the kingdom of God. We don't become a disciple about Jesus. We become a disciple of Jesus. And there's a difference. Every disciple is like the owner of a house who brings out of his store new treasures as well as old. We can bring what kinds of things we can bring. We can bring wisdom. We might have some wisdom to share with people. We might have some special truth. We might have more than that. But that's the part that brings me back to the parable of the treasure. Because the truth is, I found a treasure. I look at that story and I can see myself. I can see that when I became a believer, I found something wonderful. I found faith. I found salvation. I found Jesus. I mean, you can look at that different ways if you want for yourself, but it's a treasure. And I want us to realize how valuable that treasure really is. And how it is that I'm supposed to share from that. Because I've got that treasure. You know, I thought about this treasure and I'm picturing myself. I always like to get a picture in my mind about what that's like. So I'm walking along and I'm in this field. It doesn't belong to me somehow, but I'm there. And I had this idea that there's a treasure that's been buried. But it's beside a stream, so the stream washed some of the dirt away, and now there's a box there, half uncovered, with a treasure in it. And I open up the box and I see that this is amazing, this is wow, this is great. But then I think, wait a minute, I don't own this. If I pick up this box right now, people are going to think I stole it, right? How else would I get this treasure? So what do? I go back and I sell everything I own. I get rid of all that stuff that I thought was valuable. And now I'm able to buy the whole field. Now this is my field. Whatever's in it is mine, right? I've got the paper, says it's mine. You can't take it away from me. It's mine. Now this treasure is mine. You can't say anything about it. You can't say I stole it. You can't. It's all legitimate. It's good. But the idea there is really that I have to give something up in order to buy that, in order to get that, for it to become mine. You can look at this in a whole lot of different ways. The treasure we have in our faith is so valuable that you've got to do something to keep it. And there's so much wonderful things about this treasure. I got to really expand on that a little bit, I think, but in a minute. When Jesus says, your faith, if you want, your belief is a treasure, we have to think about what that really means. Is it really valuable to us? Is it something that we can actually share? Can I actually do that? But it's mine. I want to hang on to it. But it's like love. The more you have, the more you give, the more you get. You gotta be able to share. as I think about that, there's a few things that come to mind. There was a verse that stood up in the back of my mind as to what the value of that faith is. And it's in Peter, 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter says some interesting things about faith. And it helps me to understand what Jesus is trying to do here. In verse 6 of 1 Peter chapter 1, it says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, which is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. The trials I've gone through are so that my faith will be proved real." That's an important thing, because the treasure, if I let go of it, give it away, throw it away, do whatever, it's not real. It wasn't really all that valuable to me, right? Peter goes on, "Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls." Those things are important for us to remember, that our faith is valuable. But when Peter says we should greatly rejoice, even though you've had to suffer, that thought came to me as I was reading verse 52 again. Every teacher of the law, every scribe, or every disciple who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven will be like the owner of the house. He'll have something to share, right? My faith is valuable, but have I really been instructed in the kingdom of heaven? That's really what matters. Because Jesus says, who has become a disciple, or who has been instructed in the kingdom of heaven, who has learned something about the kingdom of heaven. That sort of makes sense when you see that Jesus is teaching these parables. He's telling you what the kingdom of heaven is like. He's saying, it's like this, it's like that, it's like the mustard seed, it's like the yeast, it's like the treasure, it's like the pearl, the guy looking for the pearl. It's like all of these things. It's not any just one of them, but it's like all of them. And then he's telling his disciples what some of those parables mean. He's explaining it to them. So he's really teaching them about the kingdom of heaven. And even if they didn't get it all, they got some. But as Peter says, you've had to suffer all kinds of grief. I'm really wondering, how do I grow in my faith? How does my faith grow? And to be honest, the way it grows the most is through suffering. I've had to suffer a few times. At the beginning of my walk with Christ, I remember telling my father about my discovery, and he rejected it. He told me I'd been indoctrinated. He told me, you don't need that kind of stuff. He laughed at me when I told the people I work with that I had discovered Christ. They would sneer at it. They would make jokes when I had my Bible at my break time. They would laugh at it. Those kind of things hurt. But it made my faith grow. I didn't turn away from God because of that. And God honors that. There's many ways we can suffer. People have told me, you shouldn't believe in that kind of stuff. What about the Crusades? Look at the stupid things the church has done. Look at all those bad things the church has done. Look at the priests who've abused children. How can you believe in that kind of stuff if that happens? That's not real. The truth is, when the church doesn't act like the church, it hurts us all. We've had that kind of experience here. We know what it means to be hurt by someone else in the church. We know what it's like to have a pastor who didn't do what he was supposed to be doing. And we need to heal from that, but it makes us grow at the same time. If we don't turn away from Christ in those hard times, we grow. Because Christ makes us grow. He sees that you didn't turn away from him when many people would have, and he says, I honor that. To those who have been given much, I'll give you more. To those who don't have much, even what they have will be taken away. Growing in Christ, growing in our faith, requires suffering. The disciples, when Jesus asked them the question, do you understand all these things? They didn't get it all. They didn't get it all really until they had to suffer. When Pentecost came and the Spirit was filling them, they began to suffer. They had to run away from Jerusalem because of it. Many people had to run away. The suffering helped them, though. It made the church stronger. All of those things helped them to grow. But when I look at that, I say, okay, in some ways I've suffered for Christ, and it made me grow. But what about the suffering that doesn't involve suffering for Christ? You know, one of the worst things I've experienced, most painful, was when my 8-year-old son, Simon, had a concussion. He was playing on a monkey bar and he fell from this height, hit the ground, hit his head. And he was in the hospital for an overnight, and I was with him. Nothing seems to hurt more than your child being hurt. You break a leg, it hurts, but when your child breaks a leg, it hurts more. You probably felt that in some ways. I don't have to explain that, I don't think, but when my son had a concussion, I was hurt. Does that make a difference in my faith? You better believe it. When you're in pain, you turn to God. He becomes your rock. And when he answers those prayers, he becomes a bigger rock. And you'll come back to him again and again, and your faith doesn't shrink, your faith will grow. So when Jesus asked the disciples, did you understand? No, they didn't understand it all, but they will later. And even though if we don't understand all of the gospel, all of the kingdom of heaven, what's it really like, it'll come if you're willing to suffer. If you're willing to suffer with Christ in his sufferings. That's a kind of a lesson that we don't really want to learn, because who wants to suffer, right? But there are benefits at the end. Peter says, all of that suffering proves the genuineness of your faith. It's greater worth than gold. Gold, if you cook it long enough, I guess it'll deteriorate or something. I don't know. He says even though refined by fire, it'll perish. Your faith doesn't do that. When your faith grows, it results in praise, glory, and honor. There's something to look forward to by letting yourself suffer with Christ in whatever way, but hanging on to him. Peter goes on. I like to hear what he says, because this passage in 1 Peter is kind of powerful. In verse 10 he says, concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that was to come to you searched intently and with the greatest care, trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing, when he predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that would follow. The prophets were doing what Jesus said. Every disciple instructed in the gospel of the kingdom of God will have something to share. Even in the Old Testament, they were sharing things that God had given them. These prophets, he says, were filled with the Spirit, and they spoke. They were doing exactly what Jesus wants us to do. How does he put it? Every teacher of the law, that's you and me, who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven, is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. That's amazing. Even in the Old Testament, they were doing that. So Peter continues on. He says, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you, when they spoke of the things that have now been told you by those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. Even angels long to look into those things. Wow. Therefore, in verse 13, he goes on a little bit more. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Be holy because God is holy. If I'm a disciple of the kingdom, I've learned about the kingdom of God. And a lot of it came through suffering. A lot of it had to do with my suffering so that my faith could grow. Someday, I'll be able to give glory and honor to Jesus, especially when he comes back, just by being a disciple. You remember Jesus asked that question, when I return, will I find faith on the earth? Will he? I think he will. I hope he will. I hope you'll find it here. I hope you'll find it in you. When I look at the treasure, it only seems to get bigger and bigger. It doesn't seem to just stay where it is. The kingdom of God is like that. Maybe the disciples didn't get it. Maybe we don't get all of what the kingdom of God is about. That's because it's infinite. There's always more to learn. I believe that even when I'm in heaven, there'll still be more to learn. God will be opening up new things all the time. It's kind of like driving down a road and you come over a hill and there's something new. It's like, wow. You know what the mathematical sign for infinity is? It's like a number 8 on its side. It goes like this, right? It reminds me of a racing track my kid had when he was young. There's no end to this road. Well, that's what the kingdom of life is. The kingdom of heaven is like. There's always going to be something new for us to learn. Praise the Lord that once we get to heaven, the suffering will be done. Amen. But as we live in this world, there will be suffering. Let's not turn away from the suffering. Things can hurt real bad. But if you let them, there's a benefit in the end. Let's be holy, because God's holy. Let's take those things that I got rid of so that I could get that treasure. Let's not go back there and get them. We've done with that. Be holy. Be like God. Be set apart for his kingdom. That's what holiness really is about. We're not perfect maybe in this world, but we're set apart. We belong to God.